Walter White stands in the New Mexico desert in his underwear, aiming a pistol at sirens he can hear getting closer. Behind him sits a camper van with 2 dead bodies inside and a fresh batch of cooked meth. He has just recorded a goodbye to his wife and his disabled teenage son on a camcorder, certain he's about to die. This was the first scene American TV showed its audience on the 20th of January 2008. Over the next 5 years, that same audience would vote the man holding the gun as one of the protagonists they loved the most. But that's strange, isn't it? We met Walter White as a sweating, half-dressed criminal standing over corpses, and we quietly decided he was our guy. What I want to get behind is something that's easy to say but uncomfortable to live with if you really think about it. Everyone has the same explanation for this: the villains finally got better written, making them more magnetic and easier to love. But that's just the surface explanation we see, and it's the wrong place to look. The archetypal hero lost his job because the world he existed to protect got exposed. Once you've seen behind that curtain, a man in a white hat defending the bank starts to look less like a hero and more like a mark. Somewhere around 2008, the white hat stopped being seen as something to aspire to and started looking like something to pity. Now I want to see how that logic compares to a few specific people who thought hard about good and evil. Friedrich Nietzsche, on where our ideas of good and evil even came from. Aristotle, on what a tragic hero actually is and what we're supposed to feel when one falls. A Russian novelist who built a murderer we can't stop arguing with, and a French philosopher who saw where this whole road ends. Then a British theorist named Mark Fisher, who died too young after naming a trap most of us are standing in. The answer I'm looking for has to explain 2 things. It has to explain why the turn away from the archetypal hero happened when it did, late in that decade and not in 1995. And it has to explain what we were actually doing when we watched these men. Judgment is the alibi we tell ourselves, but what we really watch these men for is the win. Before I get into it, let me address the objection that almost destroys my whole argument before it begins, because it's correct. The morally rotten lead character is not something new. That character is ancient, and we can't ignore that because that's the first mistake most people make with this topic. In 1667, a blind, politically ruined Englishman named John Milton wrote an epic poem about the fall of Satan, but he accidentally made Satan the most compelling character in it. Satan gets all of the best lines in Paradise Lost. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven, he says, and 4 centuries later, people still secretly agreed that the devil sounds more interesting than God does. 100 years later, the poet William Blake scribbled a note arguing that Milton was a true poet and of the devil's party without knowing it. Blake's point was sharp and a little cruel. Milton sat down to write the villain, but his own talent betrayed him, and the villain walked off the page with the reader's heart in his hand. Go back another 60 years to around 1606. Shakespeare gave us Macbeth, a loyal general who murders his king and then spends 5 acts narrating his own damnation. We're trapped inside the murderer's mind through soliloquy, hearing his guilt in the first person, and the play makes certain we can't climb back out. So when people tell us the anti-hero is some 21st century invention, just know that they're wrong. Here's where I think most takes on this fall apart. I want to highlight it because it changes the whole question. People treat Walter White like a brand new character type. He isn't, and the character under the chemistry teacher's clothes is a very old one. The question was never whether the compromised protagonist could exist, because he always has. What changed is why he stopped being the one-off dangerous archetype and became the default setting. For most of the last century, the Macbeths and the Satans were the exception we were allowed only one of, safely contained inside a tragedy that made us feel bad for liking them. In American film, that containment was literal, but rarely anybody remembers this now. From 1934 to 1968, Hollywood enforced something called the Motion Picture Production Code, better known as the Hays Code. One of its core commandments is that the sympathy of the audience must never be thrown to the side of crime or evil. Every criminal had to pay for their actions before the credits rolled. The code forbade evil from ever looking appealing. For 34 years, it was effectively against the rules to let us root for the bad guy. When the original Scarface came out in 1932, just before the code clamped down, its gangster died in the gutter. The ending was the price of creating a masterpiece. Now, this is something film historians will wince at, because I think it's true. The code actually worked at that time. For a third of a century, a censorship office did the one thing critics swear censorship could never do, and it actually kept the monster contained by force. We can despise everything about that office and still admit that the containment held. But then the containment sprung a leak. In 1967, Bonnie and Clyde put two photogenic outlaws on screen, let the audience fall for them, and ended on their bodies jerking through a slow-motion hail of police bullets that played out like a martyrdom. Audiences lined up around the block to watch that movie. The critics howled, but a year later the code was dead, replaced by the ratings system. The containment was split wide open. We got The Godfather in 1972 and watched Michael Corleone's descent into a monster while the camera stayed focused on him the entire way. 4 years later, there was Travis Bickle, a lonely man whose violence the film never condemned. Even the Western, the most overt moral genre America ever came up with, had quietly removed its white hat by then. Back in 1964, Clint Eastwood rode into A Fistful of Dollars as a gunslinger with no name and no cause, a man who plays two gangs against each other for money and walks away richer. The cowboy who once stood for the law had become a drifter who stood for himself. The antihero was loose all through those decades, but media still mostly framed him as a figure whose darkness we were meant to recoil from even as we leaned in toward him. By the 2000s, the antihero no longer needed permission to exist, and he took the center chair outright. When Vince Gilligan went around pitching Breaking Bad, he summed the whole thing up in a single sentence. He wanted to take Mr. Chips and turn him into Scarface. Mr. Chips is the beloved old school teacher from a gentle 1934 novel about the kindest man in English fiction. Scarface by then meant the 1983 gangster who drowns in his own appetite. Gilligan was selling the idea of a good man's deliberate eyes-open walk into monstrousness, and he was selling it as our weekly entertainment. But HBO passed on it. Gilligan later said that the executives in the room gave off what he called a toxic gamma radiation of disinterest. To them, the idea sounded like a losing bet. But a few years later, the same idea was one of the most acclaimed stories on television, and the only thing that had changed in between that time was the audience. The audience includes you, and now you're a part of this history. We've never seen a single show under the rule that guaranteed the villain loses, and every story we've ever loved was picked in a market where the monster is allowed to win. So the container is open, and the old character archetype is sitting in the big chair. What nobody has explained yet is why we, personally, gave him the cushion. To understand why we allowed these men to have the throne, we have to understand a trick that Nietzsche described in 1887, in a short and furious book called On the Genealogy of Morality. Nietzsche asked a question most people never really think about. Where did our idea of good actually come from? His answer cut history into two competing moralities, and the split is the key to everything that follows. The first he called master morality. Picture the warriors and aristocrats sitting at the top of some ancient society, the people who simply took whatever they wanted. For them, good meant strong, capable, noble, fully alive. Bad was just a shrug at the weak and the common, the same people they ruled. In other words, good was a description these powerful people gave of themselves. Then Nietzsche says, The people crushed at the bottom did something that quietly changed the world. They couldn't beat the strong in a fight, so they beat them in the dictionary. They invented a second morality, slave morality, that turned every value upside down. Now meekness was the real virtue, and the powerful man everyone used to admire was assigned a new label, evil. Nietzsche adopted a French word to name the core principle underneath this flip, and he kept it untranslated, ressentiment. It's a poisoned kind of envy that can't strike back in the open, so it takes its revenge on the value system itself. If you can't have the thing, you quietly rewrite the rules until wanting the thing becomes a sin. Nietzsche said he could name the people who pulled this off, but his claim made him a lot of enemies. He pointed at the priestly class, and at the morality that grew out of the ancient Near East and spread through Christianity across the West. The blessed are the meek, the poor, the mournful, the persecuted. The first shall be last, and the strong shall answer for their strength. Nietzsche refused to see that as the discovery of a higher truth. He called it the most successful revenge plot in human history, the weak convincing the strong to feel guilty for being strong, until even the powerful started measuring themselves by the values of the people they'd beaten. The phrase he coined for it was the slave revolt in morality, and he argued that we are still living inside this verdict, flinching at ambition and treating the hungry man's hunger as a sin. Now look at almost any paragon hero from the golden age of the white hat. Superman and Batman refuse to kill, the good cop follows the chain of command, and the good cowboy always draws second. Every one of those virtues is a restraint, a list of things the hero proudly refuses to do. The classic hero is admirable mostly for what he won't allow himself, which, if Nietzsche is right, is slave morality wearing a cape. But here's the catch with having restraint as our highest value. It only feels noble for as long as we still believe the restraint is buying us something. We hold back and we play fair, trusting that the system pays out to the people who follow its rules. The anti-hero is what happens to that whole bargain the moment we stop believing the system intends to pay. This is why watching Walter White cook meth feels nothing like watching a superhero win a fight. When Walt finally stops apologizing and stops shrinking, we know the answers before our morals can object. There's a thrill in it that comes uninvited. Nietzsche would say we're tasting master morality, getting a hit of the older, crueler good, the one where strength needs no excuse. Now let's bring in Aristotle, who saw the other half of this concept more than 2,000 years before TV existed. In the Poetics, Aristotle tried to work out why human beings enjoy watching good people be destroyed on a stage. His whole answer is summed up in a Greek word that people probably don't even know, hamartia. For generations, English speakers translated it as tragic flaw, some secret moral rot baked into the hero from birth. Aristotle would barely recognize that translation because hamartia is, of all things, an archery term. It means missing the mark, the arrow flying wide of a target the archer was aiming at. The tragic hero, for Aristotle, is a basically decent person of real stature who makes one catastrophic mistake and falls. Watching him fall floods us with pity for him and fear for ourself, and that flood is supposed to wash something clean inside us. Now watch what the modern anti-hero does to that ancient concept. He runs through it backwards. Aristotle's hero begins high and falls through a mistake he didn't see coming. Walter White begins low, a wronged and overlooked man, and he climbs through choices he makes with his eyes open the whole way. The old mix of pity and fear combines into something Aristotle didn't have a word for. There's no pity for Walt on his way down because he isn't far from the bottom. We cheer for him on his way up instead, but the fear only catches us later, too late, when the man we were rooting for has finished becoming the thing we should have feared from the start. The Russians saw this coming too. In 1866, Dostoyevsky wrote Crime and Punishment around a broke student named Raskolnikov, who talks himself into committing murder. His theory was that ordinary morality never bound history's great men, the Napoleons, and that an extraordinary person may step over the rules the rest of society obeys. Raskolnikov decides he might be one of those men, and the rest of the novel is him discovering that he isn't. That same theory is the blueprint of the modern antihero. Light Yagami from Death Note is a brilliant student who finds a notebook that kills anyone whose name he writes in it. He then concludes that he should remake the world by executing the wicked. We can hear that same reasoning in Walter White, a chemist who decides that dying broke entitles him to take what the world owes him. Dostoyevsky's answer to the theory was that it eats away at the person who believes it. Most of the time, the modern TV shows let us enjoy the theory for a few seasons before it makes us regret it. Stack all of that up and the case looks closed. Nietzsche explains the thrill, that forbidden taste of a morality where strength owes nobody an apology. From Aristotle, we get the change in the concept, the old fall replaced by a wide-awake climb we're invited to enjoy. Dostoyevsky supplies the theory echoing inside every one of these men, and the broken bargain explains the timing. Restraint stopped paying somewhere in the 2000s, and the audience quit buying what no longer paid. The antihero walked in to collect, the white hat died from exposure, and 2008 is on the death certificate as the date. Can you feel how satisfying that answer is? It turns our love of the anti-hero into a kind of insight, proof that we saw through the system before anything was admitted. Keep that feeling while you can, because it's about to be taken away from you. Now I have to turn the knife on my own argument because it's not foolproof, there's a hole in it. I said the Paragon hero died around 2008, and I pointed straight at Walter White. But that date was not a hard boundary. The Sopranos premiered on the 10th of January, 1999, and Tony Soprano is the patient zero of this whole turn, a killer we followed into a therapist's office for the better part of a decade. The very first episode opens on him having a panic attack over a family of ducks that flew away from his pool. A mob boss, a man who strangles an informant with his bare hands later that same season, was introduced to us as a soft, anxious dad mourning some ducks. He spent that first season in therapy, circling a dread he couldn't pinpoint, and when the answer finally surfaces, it was about his family rather than his crimes. He's terrified of losing them, and the ducks were the family. The sight of a killer weeping over waterfowl became the most quietly radical thing on TV. That was in 1999, the back half of the longest economic boom in American history, with the system humming along merrily with no clue of an impending crash. The artists were already handing the protagonist's chair over to the anti-hero, while the official story was still that everything worked. Mad Men, centered around the beautiful and hollow liar Don Draper, premiered before a single bank had publicly opened. In Japan, the Death Note manga started serialization in 2003, and its animated version aired in 2006. It gave a generation that brilliant teenage murderer. This was years before Wall Street made the news. These stories were already on the air, and already beloved, way before the crash came. And Breaking Bad itself does nothing to fall in that same circle. It premiered on the 20th of January, 2008, and Bear Stearns wouldn't collapse until that March. Lehman Brothers didn't file for bankruptcy until the 15th of September, almost 8 months after Walt first picked up that pistol in the sand. So the explanation that the financial crisis flipped the switch from hero to anti-hero might just be speculation, but the pattern of events on the calendar is too coincidental. The switch was already being flipped, all while the headlines were still going on about something else. There's another explanation here, an algorithmic one that needs none of my philosophy, but you should take it seriously if anything. It might just be business. Around the turn of the millennium, premium cable silently rewired the economics of television. HBO sold subscriptions instead of selling our eyes to advertisers, and a subscription rewards a totally different type of story. A network sitcom needs a hero who resets to 0 every week, so a stranger can drop in on any episode and follow along. Subscription drama runs differently, 60 hours of us staying hooked, and nothing hooks a person more like a man we can't quite figure out. Meanwhile, a goody two-shoes gets boring over a long runtime, and a run-of-the-mill monster gets dull too, in its own way. The sweet spot for a show we'll pay to keep watching is the man who keeps us guessing about how far he'll actually go. This business model started cutting checks to anyone who could build that man. The cable boom produced the show that saw the real target before anyone else did. The Wire ran on HBO from 2002 to 2008, and its creator David Simon kept insisting that calling it a cop show missed the point. He called it a story about institutions, the police department, the schools, the newspaper, and the drug trade, all grinding the individuals inside them into dust. In The Wire, there's barely a villain to root for or against, because the villain is the system that chews up good cops and good kids with the same indifference. It said out loud, years before the crash, that the institutions weren't protecting anyone, that the system itself was doing the damage. Read it that way, and the anti-hero shrinks from a cultural verdict into a content format, reverse-engineered by accountants chasing retention. And try to understand what's at stake if that algorithmic story wins outright, because it isn't a small loss. If the anti-hero is a retention format and nothing more, then nothing we felt watching Walt was a conclusion on our worldview. The accountants engineered the love, the way a casino engineers a near miss, and this entire investigation collapses into a marketing case study about a product that worked. I think the algorithmic story is real, and you should contemplate how much it explains before I tell you what it can't explain. The business model explains why studios suddenly started manufacturing these men by the dozen, but what it can't touch is the demand. Nothing about a subscription model explains why tens of millions of ordinary people, with no stake in HBO's earnings, looked at a meth cook and a mob boss, and felt something dangerously close to love. And that unexplained love is the paradox I still can't resolve, sitting at the dead center of all this. From the inside, we cannot tell whether we're watching to condemn the anti-hero or to envy him. The same scene performs both jobs at once. When Walt stood in that bedroom and let a young woman choke to death in front of him because her death kept his partner under his thumb, we were horrified. But some part of us saw it as a brutal power move, and both reactions land in the same heartbeat with no separation between them. The show refused to make us choose between the two because the scene only works if we can't decide. So here's where things stand. The dates say 2008 didn't cause this shift, and the accountants say the whole thing is just a format. The only thread left leads straight through you. Let me stop hiding behind the word we, because it's a dodge, and aim this where it actually belongs, at you. You watched a man manufacture poison and sell it to addicts, and you wanted the cook to come out of it unharmed. When he outmaneuvered the one DEA agent closing in, a man who happened to be his own brother-in-law, you felt relief in your chest instead of the horror. When the rival kingpin Gus Fring finally died, you celebrated, and the dealer Walt was now free to become never crossed your mind until later. I did too, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I can still remember where I was sitting when the bell rang on Gus, and my first honest feeling was relief that my guy had pulled it off. The dread came a little later, along with the embarrassing memory that my guy was a villain in the story of the thing I was watching. And I wasn't alone in it, which is the part that should concern you most. Look hard at who the audience came to hate, because it gives the whole game away. Walt cooked poison and stacked up bodies for 5 seasons, while the fandom's deepest hatred went somewhere else entirely. It went to Skyler, Walt's wife, the one person on the show who kept telling him to stop. Fans built forums and pages with names like I Hate Skyler White. The actress who played her, Anna Gunn, started getting threats that crossed over from insulting the character into promising to track down and kill her. One post she later quoted simply asked where someone could find Anna Gunn to kill her. In August of 2013, she wrote an essay in the New York Times trying to understand the rage, and she stumbled on the idea that Skyler had become a kind of Rorschach test for society. Gunn read most of that as fury aimed at a woman who wouldn't suffer quietly, and she's largely right about that. There's a second thing weaved into it though, and the two don't cancel each other out. By the back half of the show, Skyler had stopped being the conscience of the story and started being seen as an obstacle. She was the thing standing between our guy and the empire we'd quietly decided we wanted him to have. Forgiving the man who broke every rule turned out to be the easy part. The audience went further and aimed its real hatred at the woman holding back the line he was breaking. So the question stops being abstract and gets personal and a little accusing. What were we actually rooting for? The meth was scenery, and even the violence was mostly scenery. The thing itself was the permission. A business model can put a man like that on our screen every Sunday night, and it can keep him there for 5 seasons. The love for the character is a separate event, and for that love, we need Carl Jung. Jung built his psychology around a thing he called the shadow. The shadow is everything about ourselves we've refused to look at, the greed and the hunger we've shoved down into the dark. We bury it because the version of us that's allowed out in public can't be caught holding any of it, but burying it never actually kills it. It just waits down there and grows, leaking out sideways when we're tired or alone. Jung's bigger claim was that an entire society carries a shadow as well, a collective basement stuffed with everything the culture loudly condemns and privately aches for. The antihero is that basement door swinging open on its hinge. When we watch Walt or Tony do the thing we'd never let ourselves do, the figure on the screen stops being a stranger. We're watching our own shadow given a face and permission to act on its own. That's what the permission is, and it explains the love for that character in a way nothing else can. One piece is still missing though, the weirdly specific path the fantasy took, and that missing piece can be explained by Mark Fisher. Fisher was a British writer and teacher who, in 2009, published a thin and devastating book called Capitalist Realism. Its central idea lives in one borrowed sentence he made famous. It is easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. What Fisher meant is that we've slowly lost the ability to picture any serious alternative to the system we live inside. The market stopped feeling like a choice society made and started feeling like the weather, a permanent sky with no outside to it. And when we can no longer imagine changing the system, our sense of rebellion shrinks down to something small and private. That grand denial becomes a secret side hustle, where we break the rules for our own benefit instead of rewriting them with anybody else. Look closely at what Walter White's rebellion really is. He doesn't burn down the corporation that cheated him out of a fortune years earlier, and he never lays a finger on the healthcare system about to bankrupt his family over a tumor. Organizing the other underpaid teachers into anything never once crosses his mind either. Instead, he starts a small business. The product he makes has the best quality control on the market, he corners his distribution and wipes out the competition. Then he obsesses over his brand until the blue color of his meth is famous from Albuquerque to Eastern Europe. Heisenberg never throws a single bomb at the system that cheated him. He's an entrepreneur down to the bone with a brand and a market share to defend. Walter White is what capitalism looks like when it finally drops the manners, and that is the very reason we wanted him to win. This is the part that unsettles me the most when I think about it deeply. On the surface, the story of Breaking Bad just looks like a man breaking the rules. But watch closer and you'll see that he's actually following rules of the market more ruthlessly than anyone around him. He maximizes his returns and dominates his sector, then he offloads every cost onto the people near him while keeping the profit for himself. We fell for somebody finally allowed to want as much as the system trains all of us to want. Now compare Walter White to a version of his character that drops the mask entirely. The Joker, in the 2019 film, is the anti-hero with the entrepreneurial costume stripped off, pure resentment with nothing on top of it. Markets and products mean nothing to him, he just burns, and a startling number of viewers cheered his burning anyway. Walt at least let us tell ourselves a story about ambition and family while we watched. The Joker takes even that fig leaf away and dares us to keep clapping, and plenty of people did. So the demand for the anti-hero is real, and it's older and stranger than any business plan. What's still missing is the answer to the question the calendar broke, why our whole culture crowned this type of figure when it did, and that answer needs one more turn. Let me gather up my ramblings and bring everything center stage. When I said that the financial crisis flipped the switch from paragon to anti-hero in 2008, that wasn't entirely true. The switch was older than that, and the dates already prove it. So here's a more correct theory, and I think this version is the true one. No contest of charisma ever happened between the hero and anti-hero figures. The hero fell because the scenery behind him collapsed. A hero is not a free-floating object you can drop into any frame. He needs a backdrop to be heroic against. What he requires is a set of institutions that need defending and a system that rewards the people who do the right thing. Take that backdrop away, and something stranger than villainy happens to the hero. He turns absurd. He becomes the last man on screen who still believes the story everyone else in the room has already stopped believing. So what happened in 2008 hauled the backdrop away. For decades, the people in the white hats of the real economy who ran the institutions had been selling one steady story to everybody below them. Play by the rules, work hard, save carefully, trust the system, and the system will reward you fairly in the end. In 2008, the whole world watched that story detonate in slow motion on the news. The institutions that were supposed to be the careful adults in the room turned out to have been running the most reckless scheme in modern memory. And when it finally blew up, the architects collected rescue money instead of prison sentences. Hundreds of billions in public funds went to the firms that built the disaster, while families who'd trusted the same advice lost their houses. Here's the detail I want lodged in your head when you think about that decade. Out of the entire 2008 catastrophe in the United States, the number of Wall Street executives who went to prison for it was one, a single man. His name was Kareem Sarageldin, a mid-level trader at Credit Suisse. The judge who sentenced him said that the crime was a small piece of an overall evil climate within the bank, and within plenty of other banks besides. He could see it plainly from the bench. The climate was the crime, and one mid-level trader shouldered the whole weight of it right into a prison in Pennsylvania. All while the men who designed the disaster itself kept their bonuses and their reputations. 3 years later, people sat down in a park near Wall Street and started saying out loud that they were the 99%, and for a few months, the narrative was wide open in public. After we have watched all of that happen, with no real consequence for the powerful, and we tried to sell ourselves the archetypal hero again, it just didn't resonate with us anymore. The old, uncomplicated rush when the good cop trusts his superiors, or the honest man waits politely for a fair system to reward him, stopped being appealing. The white hat is now just a costume worn by a fool who didn't get the memo. This is why the anti-hero felt like he came from 2008, even though he'd been here long before it. The Sopranos, Mad Men, Death Note, that lonely Breaking Bad pilot were early tremors before the rest of us noticed the cracks. We can see the same pattern outside America, which is the part that convinces me this isn't just one country's mood shift. Japan sank into a stretch its own economists still call the lost decade after their asset bubble burst at the start of the 1990s. This resulted in long collapse of faith in the institutions that had promised lifelong security. Death Note came out of that decade plus of disillusionment. It gave us a hero who decided the system is so rotten that a teenager with a notebook should simply replace the justice system himself. There's a specific detail inside that story that should connect here. As Light kept killing, a large part of the public didn't shun him. Support for Kira slowly became widespread across whole countries, and companies started endorsing him in their own commercials. A cult sprang up that worshipped a teenage serial killer as a god of justice, and they kept holding candlelit ceremonies for him even after he died. The author put the very thing this whole argument is about right onto the pages of this manga. A population that lost its faith in its institutions will turn to love the monster who promises to fix what those institutions couldn't. Death Note showed a fictional society doing out in the open what we later did quietly on our own. That work of art was ahead of the headlines, which is what good art always is. And here's the thing that got people divided. Half of the Death Note fandom still argue to this date that Light was right. I think that divide is the best piece of audience data for this entire subject. The defense of Light is a revelation of how little faith people have left in the institutions he replaced. Albert Camus saw the cliff at the end of this road and identified it in a book called The Rebel. The book opens with a question and answers it in 5 words. What is a rebel? A man who says no. Camus then drew a fine line between 2 figures that look identical at the start, but end up in opposite universes. There's one figure, a rebel, who says no to an unjust order because there's a yes underneath that he won't betray. The rebel keeps a limit, even when crossing it would let him win, and his entire dignity fits inside that limit. Then there's the other figure, the one whose no swallows his yes, who reasons that since the old rules turned out to be a lie, no rule applies to him at all. That figure, Camus warned, ends up as a murderer, because if nothing is sacred, then everything becomes permitted. The rebellion that starts as a cry for justice gets corrupted into just another tyranny wearing a fresh face. That is Walter White's entire 5-season arc compressed into a single warning written 60 years early. He begins as something like a rebel, a man protecting a yes, his family, and his trampled dignity. Across 5 seasons, we watch that yes get eaten alive from the inside. His family slowly becomes the excuse rather than the reason. At the very end, he finally says the true thing that was underneath his whole performance. He admits he did it for himself because he liked it and he was good at it, and because cooking meth was the only thing that ever made him feel alive. His family was only ever the cover story, and the power he built was the entire point. Camus would say Walt stopped being a rebel the instant his refusal lost its limit. That instant is the moment when the show stopped being about a wronged man and became the portrait of a tyrant. Audiences kept their capacity to trust a hero the whole time, but what they lost was the belief that the world Walt defends deserves him. And a hero whose world no longer deserves his sacrifice has 2 options. Either become an anti-hero or become a joke. Look at that scene again, the man standing in the desert. Underwear, pistol, sirens, 2 bodies, and a pile of meth cooling in the van behind him. When we first met him in January of 2008, we didn't yet know that we would spend years on his side. The desert hasn't changed an inch since 1606, or 1932, or 1999. Or 2008. What's changed is the story our culture will tell about a man caught out there with blood on his hands. If the hero needs a backdrop of institutions he can believe in, then he can't come back until we also believe in them again, and right now, we don't. Calling the anti-hero a fashion gets the scale of this wrong. He's the character our culture leans toward when we have lost faith in the systems a hero would once have died defending, and he'll keep the throne for as long as that faith stays missing. That actually makes him the hero for the people who've stopped believing in heroes, the hero tailor-made for right now. Do something for me, will you? Down in the comments. Name the anti-hero who resonated with you the most, your favorite character, from anywhere. Tell me where they fall on the scale of hero to villain. For most of you, you probably don't think your favorite anti-hero is that bad. Which is fine, because that's how they're presented to us. You enjoy their stories, and so do I.